A tablet in the British Museum describes water roads extending south from Eridu, routes that continue past the ancient coastline into regions the Sumerians called the Foundation Lands. Catalogue reference BM 46462. The problem: those routes describe geography that's been submerged for 8,000 years. Settlements at coordinates no human could visit since the Ice Age ended. Distances measured in cubits that place cities under 40 meters of Gulf water. In 2006, bathymetric surveys mapped the Persian Gulf floor and found them: submerged river channels, former coastlines, linear features suggesting canal systems, all matching the tablet's descriptions. The Sumerians weren't recording mythology. They were documenting a drowned world they remembered. The Sumerian King List is not mythology. It's a historical document carved into tablets, copied across centuries, preserved in multiple versions. And according to that list, the first city where kingship descended from heaven was Eridu, not the first city we've discovered, the first city, period. Before Eridu, the King List says there was no civilization. Then kingship came down and everything changed. Archaeologists found Eridu in southern Iraq in 1855. What they discovered shouldn't exist where it does: a major urban centre built in marshland, surrounded by reeds, canals, and the shifting confluence of the Tigris and Euphrates. Eridu sat in a landscape of water. The people who built it didn't adapt to marsh conditions. They mastered them from the beginning. UNESCO recognizes Uruk and Eridu as Sumerian cities developing between the 4th and 3rd millennium BCE in what they describe as the marshy delta of southern Mesopotamia. These weren't dryland cities built near water. They were water cities. Settlements where boats were as essential as roads, where reeds provided construction material, where fish and waterfowl outnumbered livestock, where every foundation had to account for soft, saturated soil and seasonal flooding. The architecture tells the story. Sumerian temple platforms, ziggurats, weren't just religious monuments. They were elevated ground in a world of water. The earliest temples at Eridu sit on successive layers of construction, each generation building higher as the water table rose. The city's layout shows canal engineering that shouldn't exist in a first-generation settlement: controlled waterways for irrigation, drainage, transportation, waste management. This wasn't trial and error. The earliest levels of Eridu show hydraulic expertise that implies generations of prior experience. Here's where it gets strange. The tablets from Eridu describe territories to the south, places connected by water roads extending beyond Ur and Uruk into regions the texts call the Foundation Lands, or the place where the two waters meet. Scholars assumed this was religious metaphor, the boundary between fresh river water and the salty Gulf, a symbolic threshold. But the tablets give measurements. They describe travel times. They list settlements along these routes with specifics: what those places produced, how many days by boat separated them, what types of clay they quarried. If you made it this far, hit subscribe. Next week's episode covers the specific coordinates from these tablets and what modern surveys found at those exact locations on the Gulf floor. In 2010, archaeologist Jeffrey Rose published what's now called the Gulf Oasis hypothesis. His research focused on a geological fact that changes everything. The Persian Gulf wasn't always water. During the last ice age, sea levels were 120 meters lower than today. The Persian Gulf basin was a river valley, a broad fertile plain with the Tigris and Euphrates flowing through it, supporting forests, grasslands, freshwater lakes. This wasn't desert, it was prime territory for early human populations: reliable water, diverse ecosystems, natural protection from surrounding highlands. Rose's hypothesis: this Gulf basin, the Gulf Oasis, supported human populations for tens of thousands of years. People lived there, developed there, built settlements there. Then the glaciers melted, sea levels rose, the basin flooded. Not overnight like the mythological deluge. Gradual, generational, but relentless. Over centuries, the coastline crept north. Rivers that flowed through dry valleys began flooding. Settlements near the ancient coast dealt with rising water tables, then seasonal inundation, then permanent submersion. The people didn't vanish. They migrated north into the Tigris-Euphrates delta, and they brought knowledge with them: how to build in wetlands, how to manage water systems, how to construct on unstable ground, how to organize settlements around canals instead of roads. When you overlay ancient coastline reconstructions with modern bathymetric surveys, a pattern emerges. What's now 40 to 80 meters underwater was dry land until approximately 6000 BCE. The ancient river channels are still there, visible on sonar, submerged valleys cutting through the Gulf floor. Former coastlines appear as distinct topographic breaks at specific depths, and at certain locations, particularly near where the ancient rivers would have met the prehistoric shore, there are features that don't look natural. The tablets from Eridu describe routes extending into these now submerged zones. They reference settlements at distances that place them south of the current coastline, and they describe those places with the same practical detail used for documented cities like what they produced, who governed them, how many days separated them from other settlements. Here's what makes this different from standard archaeological theory. The standard explanation says Sumerian civilization developed gradually in the Tigris-Euphrates delta over millennia. But there's a problem. The archaeological record shows a gap, a period where material culture is sparse, fragmented, difficult to trace. Then around 5400 BCE, Eridu appears, not as a small farming village that slowly grows, as a planned settlement with advanced construction, organized religious architecture, sophisticated water management, all present in the earliest occupation layers. Where did that knowledge come from? And if the Gulf Oasis hypothesis is correct, the answer becomes clear. The knowledge didn't develop at Eridu. It was transported to Eridu by populations fleeing the flooded Gulf basin, populations who had been building, experimenting, refining hydraulic technology for generations in their southern homeland before the rising water forced them north. Eridu became the first city after the migration, not the first city ever built, the first city in the new location, the first successful transplant of Gulf Oasis civilization into the delta, and the Sumerians remembered. They preserved the names of the southern settlements. They maintained records of the water roads. They passed down the story of knowledge coming from the south, carried by founders who fled rising water. The tablets describe construction techniques for wetland building, methods used at Eridu and other delta cities. Driving reed bundles deep into soft earth for stable foundations. Layering woven mats between mud brick courses to prevent water infiltration. Constructing elevated platforms above flood levels. These techniques appear fully developed in Eridu's earliest layers. But here's what the tablets also describe. Building on ground that drinks water but does not flood. Stable earth near water sources. Ground conditions that don't match the perpetually saturated delta where Eridu sits. They describe quarrying clay types found along the ancient Gulf coast, but not in the Tigris-Euphrates delta. They reference timber, cedar, acacia, accessible in the pre-flood basin, but requiring distant mountain imports after the migration. The expertise was already there, refined, ready to deploy in new territory. Eridu wasn't alone in preserving records of the southern territories. Tablets from and Uruk reference the same network, settlements connected by water roads that merchants, fishermen and temple administrators travelled regularly, not vague references to distant lands. Specific waypoints described landmarks, recorded travel times. One administrative text from catalogue reference U7792, details a grain shipment moving along the southern water road through 5 named settlements before reaching the city at the edge of the bitter water. Sumerian terminology for seawater. The tablet specifies distances based on how many days a loaded reed boat required between stops. When researchers converted those travel times into actual distances using known reed boat speeds, The coordinates place several settlements 60 to 80 kilometers south of the current Persian Gulf coastline, underwater at depth between 35 and 50 meters. In 2006, the University of Birmingham and Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research mapped the Persian Gulf floor using multi-beam sonar. They were studying ancient drainage patterns for climate history research. What they found instead, features that don't fit natural erosion. Linear depressions running parallel across sections of Gulf floor, spaced at regular intervals. Channel systems that branch and reconnect. Topographic anomalies showing right-angle intersections. The pattern you'd expect from canal networks. The surveys revealed the submerged course of the ancient Tigris-Euphrates system, not the modern river mouths, the prehistoric channels from when the Gulf was a valley. And along those channels, at specific intervals, the sonar detected raised features, subtle mounds, geometric clusters, areas where sediment depth suddenly decreases, suggesting something solid beneath. When researchers compared these feature locations to the settlement coordinates from Sumerian tablets, they matched, not approximately, the ancient travel distances converted to modern measurements, placed settlements within 2 to 5 kilometers of the detected anomalies. The tablets describe construction techniques for wetland building, methods used at Eridu and other delta cities, driving reed bundles into soft earth for foundations, layering woven mats between mud brick courses against water infiltration, elevated platforms above flood levels. These techniques appear fully developed in Eridu's earliest archaeological layers. But here's what the tablets also describe. Building on ground that drinks water but does not flood. Stable earth near water, conditions that don't match the perpetually saturated delta. They describe quarrying specific clay types from deposits that existed along the Gulf Oasis coast but aren't found in the Tigris-Euphrates delta. They reference timber sources, cedar, acacia, accessible in the pre-flood basin, but requiring distant mountain imports after northern migration. The tablets from Eridu contain another detail scholars dismissed as mythological. They describe the city's founding generation as those who came from the south carrying the me, the Sumerian term for civilization's fundamental principles. The me included writing, mathematics, law, metallurgy, agriculture, temple architecture, the complete toolkit of urban civilization. Standard theory says these technologies developed gradually over millennia through trial and error, but Eridu's earliest occupation levels show advanced versions appearing simultaneously, writing from the beginning, organized religious architecture, metal tools, irrigation systems, all present immediately, not developing over time. Here's what critics don't address. In 2003, archaeologist Juris Zarins analyzed pottery styles from early Mesopotamian sites and found discontinuity. The ceramic traditions at Eridu don't match surrounding regions during the same period. Instead, they show continuity with pottery styles from coastal sites dating earlier, styles produced in Gulf Oasis settlements before the flooding. The agricultural base shows the same pattern. The crops cultivated at early Eridu, barley, emmer wheat, flax, were already domesticated when Sumerian civilization appears in the record. The animal breeds, specific sheep, goat, and cattle varieties, show domestication traits indicating generations of selective breeding. But there's no clear archaeological evidence of where that domestication process occurred in the Tigris-Euphrates delta. The domesticated species simply appear, already refined. The explanation that fits, domestication and early agriculture, happened somewhere else, in a fertile region with diverse wild populations, a region where human groups had stable conditions to experiment with cultivation and breeding over long periods. A region like the Gulf Oasis, which had exactly those conditions for thousands of years before the water rose. The flood didn't happen overnight. Geological evidence shows the Persian Gulf basin filled gradually over roughly 2,000 years, from 8,000 BCE to 6,000 BCE. For populations living there, it would have been a slow catastrophe, each generation dealing with higher water tables. more frequent flooding, shrinking agricultural land, increasing salinity in previously fresh sources. Eventually, the southern settlements became untenable. The populations migrated north following the receding coastline, settling in the Tigris-Euphrates delta, the only remaining region with conditions similar to their ancestral homeland: marshland, rivers, reeds, water everywhere. They didn't start over, they brought knowledge: how to build in wet ground, how to manage water systems, how to organize cities, how to record information, how to structure society. The tablets describe this migration not as desperate flight, but as planned relocation, groups carrying accumulated knowledge north to establish new settlements in familiar terrain. Eridu became the first city after the migration, not the first city ever built, the first city in the new location, the first successful transplant of Gulf Oasis civilization into the delta. And the Sumerians remembered. They preserved the southern settlement names. They maintained records of the water roads that once connected their ancestral homeland. They passed down the story of the me coming from the south, carried by founders who fled the rising water, who watched their world disappear beneath the Gulf. The tablets aren't mythology. They're survivor testimony, historical records preserved by people who remembered when the coastline was different, when their cities extended south into territory that's now 40 meters below the Persian Gulf surface, sealed under sediment and time. The flood narratives aren't unique to Sumer. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes a deluge that destroyed the world, with one survivor, Utnapishtim, building a boat and preserving life. The biblical flood follows the same structure. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic describes the same event. So do flood myths from ancient Egypt, India, Greece. Scholars traditionally dismiss these as universal mythology. Humans live near water, floods happen, cultures develop flood stories. But when you map the specific details, a pattern emerges that makes that explanation uncomfortable. The Mesopotamian accounts don't describe a river flood or storm surge. They describe rising water that didn't recede, permanent inundation forcing mass migration and destroying entire regions. That's not a typical flood, that's sea level rise. Geological evidence confirms the Persian Gulf basin flooded between 8000 and 6000 BCE as glacial melt raised global sea levels. The flooding was gradual but total, roughly 240,000 square kilometers going from habitable land to open water over 2 millennia. Any populations living there would have been forced to migrate or perish. The Sumerian tablets aren't describing divine judgment. They're preserving collective memory of a real environmental catastrophe. Testimony from survivors and their descendants passed down through generations until finally written into permanent form at Eridu and other early cities. In 2017, researchers at the University of Tübingen analysed ancient DNA from Mesopotamian burial sites spanning 8,000 years. They found evidence of significant population bottleneck around 6000 BCE, dramatic reduction in genetic diversity, suggesting mass mortality or rapid consolidation from multiple smaller groups, merging into larger populations. The timing matches the Gulf flooding exactly. The study also identified genetic markers in early Sumerian populations that don't appear in surrounding contemporary groups. The Sumerians had distinct ancestry, potentially from an isolated population that developed separately before mixing with northern groups, an isolated population like one living in the Gulf Oasis for thousands of years before forced migration. Modern surveys of the Persian Gulf floor have intensified in recent decades, driven primarily by oil exploration and underwater pipeline routing. These surveys use multibeam sonar, sub-bottom profilers, magnetic anomaly detection, technology capable of mapping features beneath sediment layers. In 2009, a survey conducted by British Petroleum for pipeline planning detected what company geologists called non-geological features at multiple locations in the Gulf's northwestern sector. The internal report described linear structures, geometric clustering, and magnetic signatures inconsistent with natural formations. BP classified the findings. They moved the pipeline route to avoid the anomalies. The report leaked in 2014 through a former employee who published excerpts in an industry journal. The anomalies cluster where ancient river channels intersect with former coastlines, exactly where settlements would have developed if the Gulf Oasis hypothesis is correct. The magnetic signatures suggest concentrations of fired clay, worked stone, or metal, materials associated with human construction. In 2016, a joint Saudi-German expedition used remotely operated vehicles to investigate one detected site. They recovered sediment cores showing charcoal deposits, worked flint, and pottery fragments at depths corresponding to pre-flood occupation layers. The Saudi government terminated the expedition after 3 weeks. They declared the site a protected archaeological zone closed to further research. All samples and documentation were impounded. The lead researcher, Dr. Khalid al-Rashid from King Saud University, gave one interview to a Riyadh newspaper before going silent. In that interview, he said the sediment cores contained evidence of human activity predating known Mesopotamian settlements, and that further excavation could fundamentally alter our understanding of civilization's origins in the region. Here's the question nobody wants to ask. Why does the Persian Gulf remain largely unexplored archaeologically despite obvious potential? Territorial waters divide the Gulf between 6 nations, each with strict controls on maritime research. Military zones, oil infrastructure, commercial shipping lanes restrict access to large areas. And there's political sensitivity around archaeological claims. Any significant discovery of pre-Sumerian civilization could affect historical narratives and national identities across the region. But the conditions for preservation are ideal. The Gulf floor is largely anaerobic, low oxygen preventing organic decay. Rapid sediment deposition from the Tigris-Euphrates has buried the ancient landscape under meters of protective mud. Structures made from mud brick, reed, timber, materials that decompose rapidly on land, can survive indefinitely in anaerobic sediment. If Gulf Oasis settlements existed, they're still there, buried but intact, sealed under sediment for 8,000 years, waiting for excavation technology and political will to align. The implications are significant. If Eridu isn't the first city but the first city after forced migration, if Sumerian civilization represents continuation of a culture that developed in the now submerged Gulf basin, then the entire timeline of human civilization shifts backward by millennia. The agricultural revolution, the development of writing, the emergence of urban planning, all might have originated in a landscape we can no longer access without submarines and specialized equipment. The Sumerian tablets aren't mythology. They're preserved memory of people who watched their homeland disappear beneath rising water, who migrated north carrying knowledge, who rebuilt cities in new territory, who made sure future generations remembered where they came from. The tablets are maps, historical records, testimony, and the water roads they describe, the canal routes, the settlement locations, the pathways connecting the foundation lands. Those routes are still there, traceable in bathymetric data, detectable in sonar surveys, mappable with modern technology. The question isn't whether the submerged landscape exists. The question is when we'll have full access to explore it. The structures are still there. The settlements are still there. 40 meters below the Persian Gulf surface, buried under sediment, sealed by time and politics, and the gradual catastrophe that forced humanity's first civilization to migrate north and start over. But they didn't start from nothing. They brought the knowledge with them, and they wrote it down so we would know. Before Eridu, there was something else, something older, something drowned. Next week, the specific tablet coordinates that match modern underwater detections, and what those coordinates tell us about where to look next.